Hi everyone, this video is part 4 of the 4A series for AP Psychology students. This particular video will focus on group dynamics and prosocial behavior. So as you can see in the unit outline, we are in the third part of Unit 4, and this section is called Social Situations, and it covers a lot of concepts and a lot of research studies. And it's more than I could fit into one video, so this lesson is actually the second part of the topic 4.3. These are the key focus questions for today's video. By the end, you should be able to answer all of them. These are the vocabulary concepts that I will explain throughout today's video lesson. By the end, you should be able to define and describe them. Since today's video focuses on group dynamics, it's first important to consider the reality that not every society has the same cultural ideas about the value and weight of an individual's connection to a group. There are three important cultural ideas related to the extent of connections and interconnections between individuals and their groups. And they are individualism, collectivism, and multiculturalism. Individualism refers to placing value on the individual, and people within this cultural mindset tend to focus on being independent and unique from others. In individualistic cultures, people value individualism, and their mindset tends to be focusing on being independent. In individualistic cultures, places like the United States or Canada, people prioritize personal goals over group goals. And success is often seen as a personal achievement and not necessarily a group effort. It is an important side note, though, that within a country like the United States, in an American society, in general, it might reflect an individualistic ideal, but there are many subcultures within the United States that might hold collectivist ideas within their individual communities. Collectivism is when people in a society identify more with their belonging to a group and working together rather than their individual and unique efforts. In collectivist cultures, in places like Japan or China, family and community are valued more and are more important than individual success. People feel more pressure in these societies to maintain group harmony and to fulfill the wishes and the efforts of the family and the community. Multiculturalism refers to when multiple cultural identities exist together in one society. And in these types of societies, there's a deep respect for many different traditions and perspectives that coexist together. The cultural framework we have and grow up in influences our day-to-day experiences. For example, if two students, one from an individualistic culture and one from a collectivist culture, both failed a test, the student from the individualistic culture might think more about their own efforts and their impact on their own goals and self-esteem. Like, if I don't study harder next time, I might not be able to get into the next math class I was hoping to take, and others might think I'm not very smart. Whereas the collectivist student might think, I don't want to let my family down. I should study more so they can be proud of me. I want to make sure I'm ready for college so I can meet their expectations. Research by Marcus and Kitayama in 1991 found that people from individualistic cultures tend to describe themselves using personal traits like I'm creative, while those from collectivist cultures tend to describe themselves in relationship to others, like I'm a good son or I'm a good daughter. And this study shows how culture shapes self-perception and identity. And culture affects how we see ourselves and interact with others, and even helps us understand our successes and our failures. When people are in groups, their behavior and thoughts can change in powerful ways. Just the fact that you are in the presence of others can cause you to think and act in ways that you might not if you were alone. The CED wants students to be able to identify 5 examples of this, and they are group polarization, groupthink, diffusion of responsibility, social loafing, and de-individuation. Let's start with group polarization. This is a social phenomenon that when people of similar opinions get together, they become more extreme in those opinions. In 1970, researchers Myers and Bishop studied group polarization by investigating how discussion with like-minded peers affected attitudes on racial issues. The participants were predominantly white high school students from a Midwestern city in the United States. Students were assigned to groups based on their initial levels of racial prejudice, which were determined by a pre-test questionnaire. The students were then divided into high prejudiced, medium prejudice, and low prejudice groups, ensuring that each group consisted of individuals with similar attitudes towards racial issues before the discussion took place. While in their groups, students were asked to discuss racial attitude items that were related to prejudice. And then, after discussion, students individually rated their attitudes again, and the results were compared to their initial questionnaire. The study also included a control group, which consisted of students who did not discuss racial issues. Instead, they discussed irrelevant topics before reevaluating their attitudes. This allowed researchers to compare whether the attitude changes were due to the discussion of racial issues or simply just the passage of time and re answering the questionnaire. And as predicted, discussion with like minded people significantly increased the divide between the groups. Low prejudice participants became even more tolerant of racial differences, while high prejudice participants became even more prejudiced, reinforcing their initial views. This effect was not seen in the control group, which suggested that meeting with and discussing these topics with like minded people strengthened their initial beliefs and ideas. So, group polarization occurs when people discuss issues with those who already agree with them, and their shared opinions tend to become more extreme, which ultimately intensifies the differences between the groups. The next example of how groups influence individual behavior is called groupthink. Groupthink occurs when a group makes a poor decision because the individual members place a greater value on consensus or agreement and group harmony than critical thinking. For example, a team working on a group project might all agree on a bad idea to avoid conflict instead of considering other better options. Irving Janis was an American social psychologist best known for developing the concept of groupthink, and his research analyzed historical, political, and military decisions to identify how pressure for group consensus can suppress better ideas and can suppress critical thinking. A few historical events in US history that Janis identified as clear examples of groupthink that led to bad outcomes were the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, the escalation of the Vietnam War, specifically throughout the 1960s, the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, and the Watergate scandal in the 1970s. Janis's work remains a foundational piece of research that informs social psychology, political science, and organizational behavior. The next example of how groups can influence the behavior of the individual is called diffusion of responsibility. But I'm also going to bring up another concept that's mentioned later in the CED called the bystander effect. These two concepts are intertwined and work together, so I'll explain them together here. Diffusion of responsibility occurs when people feel less personally responsible to take action in the presence of others. And this can lead to what's called the bystander effect, which is the tendency not to help someone who needs help when you're in the presence of a group because you think someone else will. We often see these on full display in emergency situations. A 1968 study, often referred to as the seizure study, investigated the bystander effect by examining how the presence of others influenced a person's likelihood of helping. College students were told they would be participating in a discussion over an intercom system with either one, two, or five other people. In reality, the other voices on the call were just pre-recorded, and one of them was a Confederate or an actor that was pretending to have a seizure, gasping for help. The key variable the researchers changed in each trial was the number of people the participants believed were also a part of the call and also heard the distress of the Confederate pretending to have a seizure. The findings showed that when participants believed they were the only other person on the call to hear the distress, 85% of them quickly got up to help. However, as the perceived number of bystanders or other people on the call increased, the helping behavior decreased. 62% got up to help when they thought there was one other person present on the call who also heard the distress. And only 31% of people helped when they thought four other people were also on the call to hear the distress. This study provided strong evidence for the bystander effect, demonstrating that as group size increases, individual responsibility to help decreases. If you've ever participated in CPR training, which prepares you with the tools to resuscitate someone who's had cardiac arrest, you know that one of the first steps is to start directly assigning tasks to specific individuals present, like pointing at someone and say, you call 911. And this strategy is to counteract the diffusion of responsibility and the bystander effect. By giving clear, direct instructions, you eliminate that uncertainty and you make one person feel directly responsible for taking action. Now, there is a note in the CED that states there are both situational and attentional factors that influence whether or not a person will step in to help someone in need. And according to the bystander effect, people are less likely to help when there are more bystanders. When there is situation that is unclear, that also leads to people being less likely to help. Or if they are distracted, or if they fail to notice the uncertainty. Those are all reasons why someone might not step in to help. Diffusion of responsibility occurs when individuals feel less accountable to act because they assume someone else will. And this contributes to the bystander effect, where the presence of others decreases the likelihood of someone helping someone else in an emergency. The next example of how groups can influence the behavior of individual members is called social loafing. This is something that I found that students really resonate with because you are very familiar with working in teams or small groups through projects that have been assigned to you at school or in your workplaces. Social loafing occurs when, in the presence of a group, people put in less effort than they would if they were alone. So you've likely been a social loafer, or you've been frustrated by a social loafer when in a group project someone slacks off because they're expecting others to take on the work. Because you've likely experienced this firsthand, you probably don't need a study to convince you that this happens, but it's important for psychology students to use research as evidence when we're making claims about psychological phenomenon. So let me share two important studies that demonstrate social loafing. The Ingram study in 1974 on social loafing involved participants who were blindfolded and then instructed to pull on a rope in a group setting. The key manipulation was that some participants believed they were pulling alone, while others thought they were pulling as a part of a group. The researchers measured the amount of force exerted by each participant and found that individuals who believed they were in a group exerted significantly less force than those who were thought that they were pulling alone. This study demonstrates that social loafing occurs when individuals feel less personally responsible in a group, leading to a reduction in effort. In a 1979 study on social loafing, researchers had participants clapping and shouting, and this involved college students who were asked to clap and to cheer as loudly as possible in different group conditions. Some participants believed they were performing the task alone, while others thought they were in a group of 2, 4, or 6 people. Researchers measured the volume of the noise produced, and they found that as group size increased, individual effort decreased. Participants made significantly less noise per person when they believed they were in larger groups. This study demonstrated social loafing, showing that people tend to exert less effort when they believe others are also contributing to the task. The next example of how the presence of a group can influence the behaviors of the individual is called deindividuation. Deindividuation literally means to remove or to lose the individual, or having a loss of self. So in the case of social psychology, this refers to when people are surrounded by others, have the tendency to feel more anonymous and less personally accountable. So this loss of self-awareness and self-responsibility in groups leads people to act in ways that they probably would not act if they were alone. For example, deindividuation can explain why people might act more recklessly in a crowd, or possibly dancing more freely than they would if they were alone. So psychologists have explored deindividuation, or the loss of self-awareness, in all different kinds of contexts, but one of the most notable is studying cheating behaviors. In the 1970s, social psychology researchers conducted a Halloween study to investigate how situational factors such as feeling anonymous, group dynamics, and how different factors of that situation would influence the likelihood of cheating. They set up 27 houses in Seattle where children arrived in costumes and were asked to take one candy bar, but not touch the money on the table. The experiment manipulated several factors, including whether the children were alone or whether they were in groups, and if they were asked to provide their name and addresses, and if the responsibility for cheating was shifted onto the smallest child. As children interacted with the setup, the researchers observed how these conditions impacted whether the children took extra candy or took the money. The study found that children who were alone and identifiable were less likely to cheat, with only 8% taking extra candy or taking the money. However, when children arrived in groups, were anonymous, and had the responsibility shifted on to the smallest child, then the cheating rate increased dramatically, with 80% engaging in the dishonest behavior. And this is a result of de-individuation, which is when in the presence of others in a group, the feeling of self restraint and personal responsibility is then shifted off of yourself, and you feel less accountable for your actions. Social psychology research has also shown that the presence of others can influence how well or how poorly we perform a task. The CED mentions a concept called social facilitation, but I'll also share a related concept called social inhibition. Social facilitation refers to the phenomenon where individuals perform better on a task when they are in the presence of others. So this means we do better when people are watching. However, an important side note is that this effect is seen most often when the task is simple or well practiced. So it's a task you're already good at and it's not particularly challenging. Social inhibition is the opposite. If the task is unfamiliar to you or it's complex, then when you're in the presence of others, your performance tends to decline. Social psychologist Robert Zions studied this phenomenon with both animals and with humans. First, in his research on social facilitation, he used cockroaches, and he found that when they performed a simple task like running through a straight maze, they did better when they were in the presence of other cockroaches. But for a more complex task, navigating a tricky maze, they did worse around other cockroaches. This showed that social facilitation happens for simple tasks, while social inhibition occurs for more complex ones. In his human studies, Zions found that people performed better on simple tasks like pressing a button or identifying words when others were present, but performed worse on difficult tasks like solving complex puzzles. So, to make sure that it wasn't just the difficulty of the task, Zions used the same tasks with and without others' presence and compared their performance to prove that social facilitation does occur, that when we are in the presence of others, we perform better on simple tasks. So far, I've talked a lot about how the presence of others can influence our actions and our performance, but it can also influence our thoughts and our perceptions. The false consensus effect occurs when we overestimate how much others around us agree with our opinions and our beliefs. And this is more about the perception of others, believing that they share the same opinions and thoughts as us. This can lead to a sense of comfort and reassurance about our own views, but it can also lead us astray and we can misjudge what others actually believe. A Canadian American psychologist named Lee Ross and his colleagues at Stanford University conducted multiple studies on the false consensus effect. One of them included college students who were asked to consider a hypothetical situation. They were asked if they would wear a sandwich board sign that said, "Eat at Joe's" around campus for 30 minutes. Then they were asked to estimate how many other students in the study would do the same. Researchers found that participants often overestimated the number of people who would make the same choice as them. This showed that people assume their own choices and attitudes are more common than they actually are. And this reinforces the false consensus effect. Interestingly, participants were also asked to judge those who made the opposite choice, and many of them judged those who made the opposite choice more harshly. So, this study highlights how people not only overestimate the extent to which others share the same ideas and opinions as us, but it also shows that people negatively judge those who held different opinions. In social psychology, group dynamics can lead to both cooperation and conflict, depending on the situation. And two key concepts that illustrate this are superordinate goals, which encourage collaboration by requiring collective effort. So, in order to succeed, we all have to work together, and social traps, which is a situation where an individual seeks short term self interest, but it leads to long term negative consequences for the whole. Now, a great example of social psychology is a study called The Robber's Cave. And this was conducted by Muzaffar Sharif in 1954, and it aimed to investigate how intergroup conflict and prejudice develop and how they can be reduced. And I'll use this study to describe superordinate goals, but we can see tons of social psychology concepts throughout this entire study. Now, the study took place over 3 weeks at Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma, and it involved 22 11-year-old boys from similar middle class backgrounds. The boys were divided into two groups, and they were called the Eagles and the Rattlers. Without knowing about each other at first, the first phase was putting the groups together and they engaged in bonding activities. In the second phase, the groups were introduced to one another and were placed in competitive situations, such as tug of war and baseball games where only one group could win. And this led to strong in group bias and hostility toward the other group, including name calling, theft, and even physical confrontations. The study demonstrated this realistic conflict theory where competition for limited rewards created intergroup conflict. Now, to reduce the hostility, Sharif introduced superordinate goals. This is when tasks require cooperation between both of the groups in order to succeed. And the researchers created different staged crises, such as a breakdown of the camp's water supply and a truck getting stuck, which involved all of the boys having to work together to solve. And over time, working toward these shared goals reduced prejudice and tension, leading the groups to become friends. The study's key takeaway was that intergroup conflict wasn't permanent and it could be resolved when the groups worked together toward shared meaningful goals. So, in summary, superordinate goals are objectives that require cooperation from all or from the opposing groups, leading to reduced conflict and increased unity. A social trap is an idea that's been proposed by an American ecologist and prominent scholar in the field of environmental science called Garrett Hardin. In his 1968 article in the peer-reviewed academic journal called Science, he wrote about a concept that has influenced the field of social psychology. He described a situation where people share a common resource, like land or water, and they must decide how to use it and how much. He notes that individual people will benefit by using as much of the resource as possible. And if everyone acts in their own self interest by taking as much as possible, the resource becomes overused and depleted and therefore ultimately harms everyone. In social psychology, they refer to this dilemma as a social trap, which occurs when people act in their own self interest, but the cumulative effort of these actions actually will lead to a worse outcome for everyone involved. Even though each individual may think they're making a rational choice for themselves, it actually ultimately hurts everyone. So, in other words, a social trap is just a situation where a short term benefit for the individual leads to long term negative consequences for groups or societies. So, you might be thinking, what about positive behaviors? Well, social psychologists do also study positive behaviors, and those are called pro-social behaviors. Pro-social behaviors can be defined as behaviors that are positive, constructive, and helpful, whereas anti-social behaviors are those that are harmful and hurtful. But in this section, I'll focus just on research related to pro-social behaviors. So when people act selflessly or in the interest of others over themselves, we call this altruism. And social psychologists study why and when people act this way. They actually have many different ideas as to what causes altruism and pro social behavior, but the CED wants students to be familiar with the social responsibility norm, social debt, and the social reciprocity norm. The social responsibility norm ties closely into altruism, so I'll explain this concept first. The social responsibility norm is the societal expectation that individuals will just help others in need. So when we see someone who needs help, we feel obligated. We feel a social responsibility to help them, especially when we have the resources or ability to do so. And we don't expect anything in return. This suggests that we have an ethical obligation to help. So if you see someone struggling to carry a heavy bag, the social responsibility norm would encourage you to help them because you can and you have the capacity to do so, and they need help. Now, the next two concepts are called social debt and the social reciprocity norm, and they're similar and they work together. The social reciprocity norm is the belief that people should return favors and kindness when it's done to them. And social debt is the feeling of obligation that you have when someone has helped you. You feel an obligation or a desire to help someone else. In Dennis Reagan's 1971 Coca-Cola experiment on reciprocity, participants thought they were evaluating paintings with another person named Joe, who was actually a research assistant. The study manipulated how much participants liked Joe by having them overhear a phone conversation where Joe was either polite or rude. In one condition, Joe gave the participant a Coca Cola as a gift, and in another, he returned empty handed. After the art evaluation, Joe asked the participant to buy raffle tickets, and the results showed the powerful effect of reciprocity. Participants who received the soda were much more likely to buy raffle tickets regardless of how much they liked Joe. They bought twice as many tickets compared to participants in the non soda condition, with some even purchasing more tickets than the value of the soda itself. This demonstrated that people feel a strong obligation to reciprocate a favor, often to a greater extent than might be expected. Since the Coca Cola study, many experiments have confirmed that reciprocity works, showing that giving often leads to receiving. And this principle of reciprocity is indeed powerful, as companies often take advantage of this human tendency by giving out small free gifts or tokens. Businesses create a sense of obligation in the recipient, which can lead to them returning the favor by purchasing products or services from the company. Now, the CED wants students to make a direct connection from social psychology into the workplace. So, you need to be familiar with one career path called the Industrial Organizational Psychologist. Industrial Organizational Psychologists, or IO psychologists, focus on understanding how people perform in the workplace, how to manage employee relationships, and how to improve overall work satisfaction. Social psychology helps them by providing insights into group behavior, motivation, and decision making, which is a key factor both in employee performance and also just workplace dynamics in general. For example, an IO psychologist could help a large company improve teamwork by using principles of social psychology. They might help train workers to fight against groupthink and then to be aware of tendencies towards social loafing. And they could use these strategies based on social influence and team cohesion to a more efficient workplace and more motivated employees. Let's finish today's video with a few short questions of review. Remember, you'll need to pause the video after I read the question to determine the correct answer. Question number 1 says, which of the following concepts is illustrated when individuals tend to believe that most others share their opinions or beliefs, even when there's no clear evidence to support this belief? Question number 2 says, in a small town, many individuals contribute to a charity event without expecting anything in return, simply because they believe it's the right thing to do. This behavior is an example of. Question number 3 says, in a high stress situation, a group of people is more likely to make risky decisions or take extreme actions when they are all in agreement. This is an example of which psychological phenomenon? This concludes today's video lesson on the applications of group dynamics and prosocial behavior. On the left-hand side of the screen are the answers to the review questions, and on the right-hand side of the screen are the questions and concepts that guided today's video lesson. Before finishing up, take a moment to check your understanding of our essential elements of today's video.